So welcome everyone. My name is Roger Berkowitz, founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to have you here tonight for, I think now the fifth installment of our Race and Revolution lecture series. Um, just want to remind you that the next lecture is a week from today on Monday um, with Bard grad Juliana Huxtable and Kimberly Foster. We're very excited to have both of them speaking to us next week. So that'll be next Monday at 6 o'clock. We're also super excited today for our talk, and I'm going to introduce the Hannah Arendt Student Fellow, Sky Carter, who's helped organize this whole event, and she's going to introduce today's speaker. Just a note, our speaker today has to leave at 7 o'clock, so it's going to be a 1 hour talk. So we'll do a quick talk and then a lot of Q&A, and we'll try and get as much in as we can. Thank you all for coming, and let's take it away, Sky.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Roger. Hopefully I can follow up with that for Sochie. So first, thank you all for coming to this event. I'm so excited for today's speaker, Sochie Nnaemeka, who hails from New York as well and is the state director of the New York Working Families Party. In this role, she leads the party's legislative strategy, electoral and candidate operations, organizing and base building, and political party business towards becoming a political home for progressive and working class New Yorkers. Since joining the NYWFP in January of 2020, Nnaemeka has steered the party in endorsing and supporting dozens of candidates throughout the turmoil of the COVID-19 epidemic and the subsequent economic and social fallout that we're currently experiencing. Under her leadership, WFP candidates have won several major congressional races, including, as you may be familiar with, Jamal Bowman in NY16 and Mondaire Jones in NY17, plus 33 legislative races in the June primary. So clearly we have a very accomplished individual in our midst. But yeah, with that being said, the entirety of the series is about trying to forge a way forward. And I thought, who better to ask than someone who was actively doing it? So Sochie, would you like to take it away?
Thank you, Sky. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Sky, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you to everyone here at the Hannah Arendt Center. It is such a pleasure to be invited into the Race and Revolution lecture series. And I heard about it. I found it so provocative, urgent, and necessary. And so I'm happy to be able to contribute and learn from this environment. Thank you to Sky for coordinating this. It's very inspiring to see visionary, focused, radically minded young people really leading the way in different spaces. So honored to be in your midst. And thank you to Dr. Berkowitz for having the space and for inviting me and joining in this conversation. Looking forward to it. So Sky says, my name is Sochie Nnaemeka. I am the state director of the New York Working Families Party. And today I was invited to talk a little bit about how we can win on transformative justice, even, or maybe even especially in the midst of this historic crisis, these intersecting crises that we find ourselves at the nexus of, and also about the future of progressive Black politics. And in particular about why it's important now more than ever that New Yorkers not only vote Trump out, but cast their votes in a way that builds our stronger multiracial, multi-generational movement for justice, in particular what we're building at the Working Families Party, and we're encouraging people to vote on our line in that effort. And so to introduce myself a little bit, I'm a New Yorker born to Nigerian parents who, despite having lived in this country for far longer than they did back home, do not consider this country their home, nor do they feel at home in this country. And for me, living in that dual identity of immigrant outsider, yet native born, and really searching for community is what first drew me into organizing. I attended Yale College, a predominantly white and elite university operated by a majority Black service workforce in a city that was gripped and ravaged by racial disparity. And I once again found myself, right, coming in as a teenager in the same inside-outside dynamic, drawn on racial lines, drawn on lines of belonging, who's inside the gates versus who's outside the gates, and unsure where I fully belonged. And it was actually through being invited to community meetings by the Black women who worked in our dining hall, right, and who led their union, their school boards, their churches by night, that I discovered that I felt most at home in solidarity-based struggle, organizing across difference towards a shared goal, sitting side by side in union halls and church basements, knocking on doors throughout New Haven, and then throughout the country, asking people about their hopes and dreams and our plans to get there. That is how I discovered who I want to be and who I am in this country. And so from Connecticut to organizing union members in Black churches in 2008 for the first Obama campaign in Ohio, to organizing my coworkers as a casino cocktail waitress in the belly of the beast in South Florida, I've really cut my teeth fighting the boss and lining up on the side of working people across lines of difference. And this is what brings me to my role at the Working Families Party, where I feel like I get to marry those two main forces again. I get to build political and community homes for working people, for Black and Brown people, for young people, for women, for marginalized identities who are taken for granted by our major institutions, who are sidelined by our major institutions. And we're also in a boss fight in a state that is led by possibly the most powerful governor since Nelson Rockefeller, where I think that we are trying to push a movement, a multiracial worker-led movement to ensure that the state actually delivers for all of us. And so I'm building off of 20 or so years that the working family has existed, where we really learned that we had to fight the boldest, cleanest, clearest demands for working people, for people of color in the electoral sphere, if we actually want to build real and lasting change. Many of us know that the Democratic Party has a platform that supports working people, that champions racial equality and universal health care, yet that's entirely disconnected from their path to win. The path to win that relies upon corporate donations, that relies upon tailoring a message to moderates or protecting white, wealthy supporter private interests, that I feel fundamentally undermines our ability to grow and build a multiracial movement. And therefore, it's no coincidence then that in governing, that agenda is corrupted by the influence of those who helped get them in power. I took this role, and the WFP exists because New Yorkers and across the country, we deserve a party in which our values are not disconnected from our plan to win. And that's what we're trying to build. And so since 1998, we've been primarying and contesting corporate Democrats and electing progressives for both open and contested seats. We do that and we strive mightily to ensure that there's no daylight between our values and our path to win. They have to be one and the same if we're actually trying to build an inclusive society, if we actually believe that those on the sidelines must be centered and must be part and must have agency to lead and to govern. We have to ensure that we don't have a roadmap that disconnects from the values that we're professing. And so we take the time to cultivate relationship-based power in working class and in Black and Brown communities that have been too long ignored. And in this process, we also show that Democrats are not the same. Not all Democrats are the same. And that there are clear ideological cleavages between them. And there are massive policy differences that then impact people's lives, whether it is the acceleration of mass incarceration that happened under Democratic leadership, whether it is austerity politics that leave too many of us with too little, right, and enshrine and protect the interests of the few. Those are policies that don't fall on red-blue lines, but that fall around, progressives versus establishment Democrats, and that's a fracture, right? That's a difference that we think is important for our party to play a role in ensuring that we're sending progressives into our legislatures. And we're a progressive party, and we don't throw around that word loosely. As a Black woman, progressive is often used to describe something that does not look like me. Yet I know that Black people have the most progressive and transformative path. When we're talking about race and revolution, let's talk about the values and the policies of Black and Brown people and who's pushing forward a universalist and transformational platform. Progressive for me and for our party means that we have an agenda that is rooted in equity and justice for all, right? And is rooted in the values of economic inclusion and democratic participation. And that if we want to win for working people, for Black, Brown, immigrant, young people, workers, we have to reimagine, we have to build structures that ensure that they actually reflect the vision of those communities and the priorities of those communities. We cannot no longer have a disconnected platform from those who both stand to gain the most from it and those who have been pushing on the front lines of these movements for decades, for generations. And so I came into the party in late 2019, ready to continue that momentum with a host of exciting primaries at the state and federal level here in New York. And then, as we all know and felt so deeply, then COVID hit New York. And New York faced a massive public health crisis. Black Lives Matter's protests exploded onto the streets. And we found that COVID and the uprisings actually had a deeply clarifying effect for all voters. Our healthcare system was and is failing us. 2 million New Yorkers, our friends, neighbors, comrades, brothers, and sisters lost their jobs. We had food lines wrapped around city blocks. And the response of our democratic leadership on the city, on the state, on the federal level is woefully inadequate. Meanwhile, the NYPD was responding to our righteous anger over racist police brutality by driving cars into crowds, and the New York City mayor defending the officers rather than sharing our outrage. At the same time, in this moment in the state, the wealthy are growing richer during a pandemic that has destroyed the lives of millions of working people, especially drawn on lines of race. And the governor has refused to raise taxes on those who have been gaining this wealth to address the growing suffering and prevent future budget cuts. And so while COVID caught everyone by surprise, at the Working Families Party, we were actually quite prepared to make sense of it. And it's because our party and our candidates have been fighting for years to dismantle the broken system that COVID-19 shone a bright light on. We've been talking and living through the crises of growing income inequality, a broken healthcare system, rampant police brutality, and systemic racism for decades. We have a framework. We already had a framework around crisis. We had an ideological stance that only became more clearly applicable in this moment. And so for our candidates who ran in competitive primaries in June, they were able to speak about the moment and the scale of the solutions it demanded, both accurately and honestly, in a way that voters migrated towards, right? In a way that actually met the sense of crisis that people were in. The transformational platform predated the crisis because we know that our solution has to be healthcare for all. Voters were recognizing the immorality and strategic failure of drawing healthcare access on immigration status, on job, employment status, and people are starting to see the fractures and fissures of our system as it was created. What was especially interesting and exciting in this moment, specifically in New York in particular, is that it really embodied an expansion of possibility of what Black politics in this country can look like. Historically, in recent history, Black electeds in the Democratic Party have risen up the political ranks on somewhat moderate platforms. Yet we saw this year WP candidates like Jamal Bowman, like Mondaire Jones here in New York, like Cori Bush in Missouri, and dozens others up and down the ballot ran on the boldest, universalist, transformative platform that were once dismissed as views that were fringe or views that were contained or espoused solely by a narrow set of the Black left, for whom political power was seen to be aspirational or delusional. Right? They centered policies like universal health care, like defunding the police, like raising taxes on the wealthy, and like clean air to breathe, and a real robust response to our climate crisis that we know has disproportionately affected our communities, Black, brown, urban communities the most. That was a platform that they led forward with. That was a platform that they won on. And their victories really highlighted what happens when we run candidates who don't shy away from their lived experience, who do not settle for a small slice of the pie, but actually demand collective liberatory politics. Jamal Bowman, for example, who is congressman-elect in the district where I live now and grew up, was a public school principal in the Bronx. And so when he talked about income inequality and racist policing and how it affected his students, his families in the Bronx for years, himself, when he talked about what it was like for him himself to be aggressed by the police at the age of 11, his message resonated with voters and electrified voters. Mondaire Jones, who grew up in Section 8 housing and on food stamps, knew firsthand what it felt like to grow up in a family that couldn't always make rent or couldn't put food on the table. No one needed to translate for Jamal or Mondaire when they're speaking to voters. They understood the crises, they understood the depths of these crises because they'd been living through them and fighting to avert them since long before COVID or the BLM uprisings brought them onto the front page. The future of progressive politics, of multiracial, Black-led progressive politics, is rooted in our commitment to centering authentic voices of those who know what injustice looks like firsthand and who want to build bold coalitions and bold platforms to confront them full on. And because we know that when Black leaders reject short-termist or slices of an overall pie, right? Reject purely representational politics and embrace the policies that working people across racial and geographic lines want, while also being quite specific and particular to the needs, the urgency of Black communities, that we can win in a way that we all can win, right? Mondaire Jones won in a majority white district. This is a shift in our politics. You can have Black progressive leadership speaking on bold, transformative platforms, be elected to represent in majority white, right, but multiracial communities. This is a historic moment in our country. And so that candidates like Jamal and Mondaire could be elected is also a testament of the symbiotic relationship between organizing, which we prize and center at the party, and voting. We have to take time to cultivate the relationships in communities that have been too long ignored. And we have to then match that everyday organizing with strong electoral campaigns. If we don't do that, we limit the tools at our disposal for actually transformative vision and to be able to transform vision into policy. So this year, in this moment, what we're asking for is we don't just need to vote Trump out. We need to vote for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris on the Working Families Party line. I'm going to say why. As I've said, the WFP has stood up to corporate interests for years, right? We passed a $15 minimum wage. We passed paid sick leave. We passed campaign finance reform, the historic climate legislation, historic tenant rights protections, all aimed towards shifting a balance of power away from the few and towards the many. And it's no surprise it has made us a couple of enemies. It has made us a target in some ways. And so this year we face a higher burden. This year, the party, the WFP, to keep our ballot, we must get 3 times the previous threshold requirement. So what used to be 50,000 every 4 years is now 2% of total turnout. So about 170,000, depending on the year, every 2 years. And so this year we're urging people to vote for president on our line, to keep our ballot line and to keep our multiracial progressive vehicle in the state to ensure that working people have a chance in a moment of historic crisis. Because of fusion voting, which is also an important democratic tool, because of the rights that third parties have in New York, third parties have historically played an important role in our freedom movements, from the Mississippi Democratic freedom movement to the abolitionist movement to suffragettes. The role of the third party has always been about shifting a power balance, at least on the progressive side, right? From the few to the many. And so here in New York, we need to protect the robust democracy that we have. We need to increase participation rather than limit it. And so to keep building our movement for Just New York, we need to keep bringing the voice of the protests to the polls. We need hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers like yourselves voting on the WP line. And it doesn't just protect New York's Progressive Party. It also sends a message nationally that we will not accept a return to the status quo, that we can have a multiracial, cross-class, intergenerational progressive movement pushing for universalist and bold programs that we know that will ensure that none of our communities are left behind. And so by holding the administration, whether it's in the White House or whether it is here in Albany, their feet to the fire on the policies we need for a better world, whether it's healthcare for everyone, of real robust response to our climate crisis, taxing the rich instead of forcing Black, brown, working people to bear the burden of budget deficit. We have to be building our movement. And I have no doubt that our multiracial movement will continue to build grassroots power, momentum, and strength in the years to come if we stay the course. And that's for us, is if we double down on demanding transformational change from our elected officials, not incremental adjustments. If we continue to run bold, diverse, progressive groups of champions, not status quo candidates. If we reject the narrative, what is viable, right, based on what schools someone went to or how much money they can raise, but think about viability based on how connected someone is to community, how urgent their platform is, how connected they are to the vision, the priorities, the values of their neighbors. If we run campaigns in which our plan to win is deeply aligned and comes out of our values, and if we fight tirelessly for organizations like ours, for durable, long-term institutions like the Working Families Party and up and down the state, independent progressive organizations who are building power and building coalition to back these candidates every day, we should start creating these platforms, these foundations for transformation. We can ensure that New York is actually a progressive beacon in our state, and we can ensure that we are building a New York that works for the many. So thank you. I'm looking forward to the conversation with others.
Thank you so much, Sochie. So first of all, let me say that you can ask questions in two ways. You can post them in the chat and I'll ask you to read them if you want, or I will read them. Or you can use a hand raise function by going down to the participants button, clicking on it, and then going over to the right and raising your hand. I'm going to ask two quick questions, or one quick, which is, not everyone here knows exactly how voting works in New York, Sochie. Some of these students are first time voting in New York. Could you just explain what it means to vote for a candidate on the Workers' Family Party, which I've done many times? And secondly, maybe the more substantive question, to what extent, is this, as you said, an unabashedly progressive movement? Is this part of a race and revolutions, movement? I mean, there are many, as you well know, Black conservatives around this country and the state. How does that fit in, or does it? Is it that we're just a progressive movement within the party, or you said multiracial many times? I'm just wondering how that fits in and how you speak to a wider, diverse Black constituency.
Absolutely. Thank you, Roger. So to answer the first question, if you're a registered voter in New York State, you can vote in three ways. You can vote by absentee, so you can request an absentee ballot online, and I can drop our website that has information about that in the chat. You can vote early in person, which is new in New York this year. And so starting this weekend, starting October 26th through November 1, you can go into a polling location and vote in person early. We're actively encouraging people to do that. If you feel safe and secure to go out in person, the lines will be shorter than it is on election day, and you can cast and know that your vote will be counted on election day. And the third way is to vote on election day, right? So vote on Tuesday, November 3rd, and to go into your local polling place and to go in. There's resources online to make sure you're registered to vote. We encourage people to make a plan to vote. Check your registration, make sure you know what your polling location is. Even though you're not required to have an ID, if you do have an ID, please bring it, because there sometimes are complications at the polls, but you are not required to have an ID to vote. Make sure that you know where your location is. Think about your transportation route. Think about how much time. Some people who are early voting in other states already seen lines of an hour or so, right? So budget enough time to ensure that you can go and cast your vote. And then you'll see your ballot, and the Working Families Party line is row D. And so you'll see candidates that are endorsed by the Working Families Party line. At the presidential level, we have endorsed Joe Biden, Kamala Harris. We know that we need a united front to defeat Trump, to throw out the fascist, white supremacist, racist, nativist politics that have been occupying the White House for the past 4 years. And we also know that we need so much more. we believe, we with our politics, we believe that Biden is a door, not a destination, as the party says. We have to walk that door if we even want a fighting chance to create the world that we know that we need, a real response to our rapidly accelerating climate crisis, for a real attention to the rampant police brutality that has gone without address in this country. We know that we need that door, and we know that those politics that are maybe espoused by the establishment Democratic Party right now is not our final destination, but we need to start running towards that. We need to be able to build our movement. And so voting on our line ensures that you're not spoiling, you're not making it so the Republican, or, if those are, I'll speak to our party's politics, right? Ensuring that a Republican does not win, but also signals that we want something more, right? We want to defeat Trump, and we want a real response to our crisis. We want a real recovery for all of us. So you can find the Working Families Party line, vote for president there, and then, move down ballot, which we also encourage people to do. I will put votewfp.org, has a lot of resources that people can also check out and learn a little bit more about voting and what our platform is. And then to Roger's question on what we mean by the multiracial progressive movement, we think that representation is deeply important, and it's not sufficient. We need to ensure that we have a diversity of experiences, diversity of leadership in this moment in which too many of us have not been given platform or space to run, right? To really center and bring the needs and the priorities of our communities into a majoritarian governing agenda. We do need to transform that power imbalance that's really meant that a majority of voters and a majority of Americans are not actually fully represented. And we believe that our representatives and the candidates we run need to have a vision for an inclusive democracy and inclusive economy. And so we look for candidates who are speaking to the real solution, the real crises are affecting our communities, right? Who are understanding the need for proper and deep, housing for all, who understand that we need jobs programs that center dignity and shared prosperity, right? That don't have a scarcity mindset, that do not believe that we need to be operating based on short-term cuts, but rather we are a party of investment, invest in our communities, invest in young people, invest in our planet. Those are the politics that we need. And so while we look for candidates who in particular either represent groups that maybe have not led before, are connected to their community in a real way, inspire and animate a part of the voting bloc that has otherwise been, completely ignored, whose doors are not knocked on, and who share our politics, who share our vision, who share our platform. One without the other is not enough, but we need to have a values-based connection. And so we talk to everyone too, to your question about, Black conservatives. Our politics are not a politics of purity tests. We know that we need a bigger movement if we're going to win. And so we will talk to everyone. We will figure out where people are coming from and try to move them into relationship with us by talking about the values. And what we saw this year is that across geographic lines, across racial lines, voters did vote for progress. There's overwhelmingly success in our primary suite. It was not a downstate only occurrence, right? In Rochester and in Buffalo and in Ithaca and in Plattsburgh, we saw real progressive candidates win. And so we need to ensure that we're talking to everyone. We're making sure people are clear about what we mean. We're not just using taglines. We're explaining to people what Green New Deal means. What does it mean to you to have a just transition, millions of jobs? How does that affect your community? That's what we need to do as organizers. Ensure we don't leave anyone behind and we don't leave any votes on the table.
Great. There's a question from Inji, which is a great question. I think you're going to like. How do you join your party and play a leading role?
Absolutely. So we're across the state. We have chapters. If you also check out our website, there's a way to plug in. Right now, because we're in virtual spaces, we are online a lot and we build community that way. And people build leadership by coming to events, by knocking on doors, by spending time calling for a candidate, by recruiting more people into the party. And there's a multiplicity of roles. We want to create real pathways to democratic participation. We want our party to be fueled by people, right? Not by corporate interests. And so we need people who are active in building the party across all lines of difference. It is possible for non-Black people, I was looking at Inji's comment, we need leaders across all spectrums, and we need to ensure that we're creating spaces for those who've not been leaders before. And so that might be lines of age, that might be geographic lines, that must be lines of race or language. We have a very big language justice component to our party and ensure we have interpretation services. We want to create an entryway to do genuinely multiracial participatory politics. And that requires all of us, as long as we have a shared vision, a shared agenda, and we're ultimately trying to build a space that works for all of us together. That's what our party is about.
Yeah, I'll just add that one of my former students is the one who actually recommended that we reach out to you,
Absolutely.
Emiliano Lage, who's now, I think, she has a leadership role in the party. I'm not sure exactly what it's called, but they
Yes.
really do welcome young people and students into the party and take leadership roles. So students who are interested, you should definitely reach out.
Absolutely. It's such a great way to get to know your communities, your issues. It builds pipeline of future candidates, right? Emiliana, who's a state committee member in Westchester, who works for a local, state senator, who's a real organizer, bringing more people into relationship. That's what we're trying to build. And there's definitely a lot of space for folks to throw in and to learn together and build something together and to win together, which is pretty exciting.
Great. I know Sky has a question. So Sky, do you want to jump on in, unmute?
Yeah, yes, please. Well, first of all, that was a great talk, and I really appreciated everything.
Thanks,
But
Sky.
I wanted to ask, I think so Roger spoke to Black conservatives. I think I want to speak to like even the more radical side of Blackness, or that being a lot of students and people that were disillusioned by the protests and disillusioned by the current political system,
Mhm.
and those who really don't want to vote at all.
Mhm.
I kind of want to ask, so for you, it seems like you've been organizing nationally from my home state in Florida to New York up here, and clearly you've had a lot of experience within and without the system. So why, knowing the ins and outs and the injustices of the system, knowing and maybe also feeling like um, there is a lot of work to be done to make this fair and equal and almost overwhelming. Um, I want to ask, why did you choose to start working within it to try and make change? Um,
Yeah.
and
No, I
what
think
would
it's a
you
great
say?
question. No, I think it's a really great question. So I've done a whole bunch of organizing in different ways. I did underground labor organizing, which is um, different form of organizing, right? I think that I got to a place where I recognized the harm, the deep, unrelenting harm the state was lavishing on our communities. I knew that if we want to contest for real power, if we want to actually shift outcomes, we had to be able to marry our electoral strategy with our protest strategy, right? We had to be able to move from outside agitator to governing. I don't think one is possible without the other. I don't think that uh, protest politics that do not get incorporated and shifted into our main discourse uh, leads us to liberation. I don't think that we know that voting is one tool in our toolbox, right? And electoral politics is one tool in our toolbox, but there's immense power inside the system, as you say, and the role that we have as a third party, though, is someone outside the system, right? We have to be able to work in both lanes. We want to contest for power in the electoral space because we know that decisions are made there deeply affect our communities. If we think about the budget, right? Budgets are moral documents, right? They reflect what people care about. They reflect who people want to invest in, who people want to cut from. a lot of the protests and a lot of our comrades in the BLM movement, right, and a lot of the work that I did before I was in the party was all about resource shifts. We're talking about defunding the police. We're talking about budgets. We're talking about how do we divest from what causes harm in our communities and invest in what actually makes our communities thrive. If we don't contest for power in the budgetary space, whether it's through, their forms of participatory budgeting, or whether it's through electing and pushing and holding accountable and co-governing with elected officials who themselves construct budgets, it feels like we need to have a strategy that operates on many fronts. It is not enough for us solely to be in one space. But for me, I felt after the 2016 election in particular, where there was this beautiful big tent that was created against Trump, and a fear maybe that the big tent was diffusing or diluting our demands, right? How do we build this big tent and ensure we know what we stand against, but within the tent, make sure we're also talking about what we stand for. What is our vision? It can't just be what we're against. It has to be about what we want to provide in the alternative. And so our work is about taking that vision and translating it into actionable demands, translating it into policy, and ensuring that we have the decision makers and allies who can enforce and push for that on the inside, as we have the mass movements that are setting that, that visionary standard on the outside.
Sky, do you want to follow up, or not?
I think I need to sit with the answer a little bit before I can follow up.
Okay, I hope I got to your question, Sky, but that's like the question, right?
Yeah. I mean, just a thought it made. We had on this same series about a week or two ago, Omar Wasso, who was speaking about his research on the relation between protest and politics, and can it make a difference? And what he found is that protest that takes on a positive tone and is nonviolent leads to real change. But protest, as soon as it becomes violent, has actually had negative effects. I don't know, how does the Working Party, Families Party, have a position on how to protest?
I mean, I think there's we try to shape the debate right through protest. It's important to have a demand, it's important to have a vision, and it's important to recognize that sometimes what is protest is denigrated or named something different by the media, etc., to marginalize or to villainize protesters. So I think there's one thing about just that we aim not to name right forms of protest. Protest comes from rage. Protest comes from disappointment. Protest comes from using what tools that you have in order to shake something up. And for us, does a protest have a demand? Does it build towards an inclusive vision? Does it shift narrative and shift consciousness? Does it move people into action, move people from a place of cynicism or marginality into feeling like agents in our democracy? That is what we're seeking. And so while we are not engaging, we don't have a theory of violence in this movement. We've never felt to center or posit the necessity of that. And we see movements that are beautiful, that are robust, that are messy, and they're nonviolent, be named something that they're not, right? To be villainized in that kind of way. And I think it's really important for us to protect the right of protesters and to recognize the grounding, right? Recognize the roots of protest.
Great, thank you. There's a question from, if I get the name right, Ilan Riccardi. As we go down ballot, how do you suggest we make sure we are briefed on the agenda of the people running for borough president, New York Supreme Court, etc.? Do you have just some advice on how to inform oneself?
Yeah, I mean, so generally, we encourage people to vote down the ballot if you share politics, right? We don't endorse in every race, but we do have a robust process that endorses and considers candidates in a lot of races. So the judge judicial candidates are tricky, but I think really reading their platforms, judicial candidates don't necessarily fall along clear partisan lines. Lots of judges are on every single party line. It really does depend a little bit on county politics more than like ideological or like values based. So I look at organizations who you trust, whose politics align with you. I look on key issues, whether it is what is their answer to the role of like money in politics, or, reproductive justice issues, like thinking about the issue that matters most to you and looking at the candidate and researching there. And on the party website, we do have a list of all of our endorsed candidates up and down the state, and also welcome questions. If people have specific questions about someone who maybe is on our line, who they're confused about or is not on our line, we also take questions at New York at workingfamilies.org. But part of the party, to Indy's earlier question, right, our activists get together in rooms or virtually now and look at candidate questionnaires, pour over 90 or so questions that we ask our candidates, and debate and talk about how that candidate's politics or answers line up with our views. And that's what fuels our endorsement process. And so we have a grassroots-led effort of mining through information and then interviewing the candidates before endorsements. So that also kind of leads us to the slates that we endorse.
Thank you. There's a question from Greg Monoff. Last week we had a full day webinar at the RN Center, and it's something we've been working on something called Citizen Assemblies. Partition. I don't know if these are words that you are familiar with or not. But basically using random selection of citizens to pull people together, meet with experts, talk, have facilitators, and come up with agendas or even policy suggestions as a way of A, bringing a wider range of people and voices into the process, and B, avoiding or overseeing an electoral process, which is often quite aristocratic in the sense that it costs a lot of money and it often elects people who are not of the people in many people's way. And so Greg Benoff asks, has the Working Families Party looked at advocating for non-electoral direct citizen participation strategies like lottery-based citizen assemblies to revitalize democracy? Is that something you have looked at or might be interested in?
I think definitely interested. We're actually thinking, we had a little meeting with some of our electeds this week and thinking about a democracy package we can put forward in the, in the new year, and what are ways precisely in this moment when a lot of people are looking to get more engaged, but yet the pathways to participation feel more opaque, right? Ballots are being tossed out, people don't have clear information. How do we actually have real opportunities for that? The party nationally, we've had great relationships with movements across the world, right? Kind of the municipalist movement in Barcelona, citizen assemblies, right, in Mexico, a world transformed, right? They have the Labour Party in the UK, and very much looking at models for those two-party system we know doesn't really work, yet we are holding on quite tightly to it in this country. What are other ways that we can actually ensure that people's voice and people's vote and people's participation actually affect change, that actually make outcomes? And how do we get more people excited and engaged in our democracy? So I think definitely we have not looked particularly in the lottery-based citizen assemblies. I have seen models of them. I know in South Africa they have kind of requirements of participation that work in really interesting ways. But I think it's essential that we think about some of these new structures. And the New York City Council in particular this year, when they have a big opening, and thinking about like participatory budgeting, other structures like that, there is an opportunity to pilot a bunch of these things next year.
Yeah, I mean, participatory budgeting is another idea. New York had a small experiment with it that I tried to get involved in, but it was so small it was almost meaningless. I mean, we were talking about $5,000 for the entire Upper West Side, and I was like, why am I going to spend my time on this?
Right. No, people have to believe that their participation actually makes a difference. Otherwise, it's a game. So we need to make sure people actually, if you're offering people power, it's real power.
I'll reach out to Emiliana more about the lottery thing, and maybe we could even work on something.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
On the idea of power, I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit about that too. Was more in the sense of like, with my first question in regards to those who wouldn't like to vote, there's also like a prevailing opinion that I've heard amongst like the POC community and elsewhere that like others kind of, or following, I think, the protests and in general, that it actually might be more effective to just create power within your own communities, as the idea is that prevailing politicians and like those who, even when, for example, like AOC and others who are voted from their communities and then have to leave their communities to then advocate for their communities, there are ideas that like maybe since our government already doesn't pay attention to us or does not see to our needs and takes those who actually could help us out of our communities and then changes their minds about certain things. I've heard a lot of people more so be like, I'm going to put less of my energy into my voting power and more of my energy into building community power, focusing on community leaders, community programs, things like that. Do you think those ideas are in opposition to each other or have to be, or?
Yeah. No, I think that it's not an either or, right? I think that one without the other doesn't get so far. I think there's a couple of things that I think a little bit in both our politics and what we're doing in the party. I think one, we can't have candidate-centered movements, right? Our elected officials are meant to carry the mandate, the mission, the request of our communities, but they're meant to do that. My first organizing job was on the Obama campaign. His story in particular spoke to me, for kind of a very unique American story, but that yet, there's space and an opportunity to lead many and to really define your Americanness. And I was deeply disappointed by the demobilization that happened after Obama was elected, right? That was a failure of our movement because we invested singularly in the candidate, because we believed that because he was elected, we were good. And we saw how hard the ACA fight was because of that. We saw how hard it was then for us to move many things through his administration. And what we had was a mass movement mobilizing those leaders. Like we just, in Ohio, thousands of leaders, a beautiful neighborhood captain model, right, where people were activated, were tapped, were recruited to represent their communities, to go back and talk to their neighbors and friends about the campaign. And that infrastructure completely fizzled afterwards. So we believe that we have to both, I think there are a couple of things. We have to have campaigns that are rooted in values and ideology and not in the candidate themselves. A campaign downstate that I think modeled that, and this theory of losing Ford, which I'll talk to you about too. Tiffany Caban ran for Queens District Attorney office. She lost by 40 votes. However, after that campaign, the idea that prosecutors must play a role in ending mass incarceration has become a common parlance around the country. Chesa Boudin, now DA in San Francisco, Larry Krasner in Pennsylvania, Kim Foxx. That was a campaign that was clear about what values it was rooted in, and that outlives a candidate. So you have to make sure, first of all, we have the clarity about what kind of narrative shift we're trying to make. Two, we have to organize all the time. We cannot organize our lives around electoral cycles. We need to find and invest in leaders. We need to build durable year-round organizations. Because what happens, for example, now, the Democratic Party is spending gazillions of dollars all over the place. That money, that investment will be gone on November 4th. Because that's what happens. Every year there's booms and busts, and that's kind of how the electoral complex works. You pour in, and then you leave. And we have to think about long-term infrastructure building. We have to think about invest in community leaders, invest in things on the ground. What I think is interesting about the AOC model that you have mentioned is that her campaign is really invested in organizing. How do we use her space, the resources that her campaign has grown to teach and to train folks, whether it's on mutual aid, whether it's on organizing, workers' cooperatives, how do we build more movement candidates? And that's part of recruiting candidates who come from movement, and we're clear that they're not being sent off, you know, as a tribute or like an emissary or something, but their role is representation in the body. Our role as a movement is to ensure that our vision is clear, that we're growing, that we're building, that we're bringing in new leaders, because our fight for justice is long and will outlast any congressional cycle or congressional term. We have to build deep infrastructure all the time.
Sochie, where do you see the main where do you see the main future of this movement that you're trying to build? Is it in young people? Is it in cities? Is it all over? Where are you looking? Where do you find people willing to join up?
No, I think that there are many really interesting polls and spaces, and it's about kind of what we do with them. I have taken incredible, I personally have been incredibly impressed and inspired by a host of youth movements. I think Sunrise has been shifting the public narrative and the urgency, right, around what is possible, what kind of crisis we're in. I think the Dreamers movement really shifted the dial too on what is respectable, you know, who is allowed to perform, what roles, what does belonging look like, the kind of undocumented and proud. I think as it comes from a real, you know, radical tradition of taking what is seen, what is otherized, what is shamed, what is invisibilized, and making that the source of power. I think the Black Lives Matter movement has shifted our entire collective consciousness, right? You look at public opinion polls, how much Americans have shifted in what they think is just or unjust. And so I think for us, looking at movements that are very clear about, you know, it is not a short-term campaign, but we know that we need to move and transform hearts and minds over time in order to really transform our country. I think I've seen it along, you know, across generational lines, across regional lines. I think that's the power of our movement, right? Can we actually organize across lines of difference? Can we actually grow the bigger we? That is what the kind of power that we need. I think the labor movement, we have to continue to invest and build the labor movement, because, you know, the labor movement and like work sites are real, you know, laboratories of like multiracial solidarity, right? Like what other spaces do we have that are from the get-go multiracial and worker class and working people led? And we have to invest in our movements to shift what they're doing from outside work, from protest or organizing into governance. And so I think there's a host of different organizations and movements doing that work that we take deep pride and deep humility to be able to work with.
Okay, great. There's sort of two questions that are on the table, and we've got about 5 minutes, so I'll maybe present them shortly and you can try and respond if you can. One is from Ellen Peckman, and it's basically what specific experiences do you and your colleagues have in breaking through the noise of politics today to reach disillusioned voters? You know, she says she's been asked to make phone calls and whatever, and I think there's a worry that this is not working. And what's working? And then there's a question from Susan. The Democratic Party has, in the words of Dr. Ibram Kendi, who was here last year, practiced cultural racism directed against folks in the Saugerties Fish and Game Club. There are thousands of such organizations in the US. No, these are not militias. These are working people and small business owners with perhaps a basic level of education. Why should these folks support the Working Families Party? I guess the question is, and this is, you know, is to what extent are working families in this country, many of them not ready for a multiracial family party, or at odds with a multiracial progressive party? I think is the question, if I understand it. Susan, if you want to add to it, but I know you're short for time, so maybe you can figure out how to answer.
Yes. I mean, so to Alan's question, I think that we try all of the things. We need to reach voters, including across digital divides, right? That not everyone has access to the technology. What we do regular bread and butter is knocking on doors and talking to people, or going to find people where they are, going to community centers and churches, finding people where they are already in relationship. That's ideal. That's number one. During COVID, we've definitely been trying different methods to engage people across platforms. Calls and texts do move people when they respond. People do like to be spoken to and asked, what their hopes and dreams or wants are, to share information with them. The number one thing that we invest in, that we want to talk about, which is key to organizing, is relational organizing, right? So you are more likely to move or do something if someone that you know and care about asks you to do that. And so we ask people to do is to we use something in particular called the Reach app, which was kind of developed and perfected on AOC's campaign. And it allows you to upload your contacts and you can text your friends directly, because these are the type of conversations we need to have. We need to be able to speak from a place of personal and self-interest and move people into action. I had a conversation yesterday when someone was asking, like, how do I talk to my aunt who is a Trump voter? And it's like, tell her what is at stake for you in his reelection, right? Like, what liberties, freedoms, what opportunities or possibilities for how you can, live in this country are directly under attack. When we do not alienate ourselves from each other, when we speak from a direct self-interest and move people into action with us, we feel like that is the most effective. So we've been encouraging people, especially since we're not knocking on doors, to take a list of your friends. We can help you figure out the tactics of it, but commit to speaking to at least 10, but really more. We have like 12 days, Ellen, so say like 10 a day, and say, what is your plan to vote? Why is this election urgent to you? How can I help you make an informed decision or move into action? I think that is the thing that really sticks. That sticks for people more than the technology. It's the approach and the touch. So we're trying to do that at scale. We're trying to get thousands of people to talk to their thousands of friends and family about that. And then to Susan's question, for us, it's values-based, and we find that that works in different places. The party both has been a place where, downstate, like affirmed, like self-avowed, like leftists do politics together. And it's like the margin of difference in upstate districts, like in Congressmember Brindisi's district, where the margin of, he won because of the votes that were on the WFP line, because people, maybe, I'm not sure exactly who you're speaking to here, but people who didn't see themselves in either party, but were saying, jobs are leaving our community. I can't afford healthcare. Like, I feel left behind by the system, and neither of the two parties are speaking to that. And our line and our party was a home for that. And so then we have to do the work internally then to try and align people who come in from different entry points, but similarly have a sense that the state or this country is not working for all of us. That becomes the work of organizing. And so we don't use catchphrases. I think even progressive, I try to explain what progressive means, because I don't want it to be something that people feel like, oh, well, that's not me. When you're saying that word, you must not be speaking to me. Let's talk about what that actually means. Do you believe in justice for all of us? Do you actually want a real response to this crisis? Do you believe that you should have jobs with dignity? Let's put out the platform and find alignment based on that. And doesn't work for everyone, right? That does not work for everyone. We put out our North Star. Some might head towards it. Some might choose it's not for them. But ultimately, we want to make sure that we're building something bigger than those who hear the call and know it's for them. We need to explain the call and give people a chance to hear it out and then decide whether they want to be in community with us. And that's fundamentally the work that we have to do.
Wow. Thank you, Sochie. The reason really wanted to bring you here today is because you're out there actually bringing this fight to the ballot box and to the country, and trying to create workable solutions through politics. And as Sky said, I mean, there's debates, some people in the system, some people out of the system. And I think as Sky was pointing out, a lot of our students are suspicious of the system, and it's really important for us to hear and them to hear from someone like you who's really working in the system to I think bring about a revolution in a very meaningful way. So I want to thank you for joining us today. Do you have any final words or
No,
not?
thank you. I think thank you both for the provocative questions and for the real challenge. We have a challenge in this moment, and I feel like if we commit ourselves to finding out what our best role is in bringing about transformative change, right, that centers all of our needs, we may not all end up in the same lane, right? We may not all wear the same hat, but are we heading in the right direction? We have an opportunity in this moment to redirect where our country is going. Crisis provides opportunity because people are called to question all of their assumptions and understandings of how the world works. How do we take advantage of this moment to allow people to dream, vision, and then work towards a world, a system that does not leave so many of us vulnerable and excluded. And so whatever hat we're wearing, as long as we're aiming towards that together, I feel quite hopeful about the future of our country. And so urge people to get to know the party, to look, votewfp.org, encourage, ask, and would be so excited, right, by the thousands of you who will vote on the Working Families Party line this year to build our movement, to defeat Trump, to ensure that we're pushing New York in a brighter and more progressive direction, this moment of crisis and opportunity, and then to build in your neighborhoods, in your communities, because democracy is Jamal Bowman says, democracy is a contact sport. Right? You got to get in it. We got to get in it. We can't be viewers on the sideline. We have to participate. And so we want to find opportunities and sites for people to participate fully. So we hope that you all join us in that.
Thank you very much, Sochie Nnaemeka. It's a pleasure to have you here, and good luck in the next 2 weeks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. So grateful for your time. Be well.
Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you. Thank you, Sky. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you all.